In addition to constructing dark, macabre, and surprisingly sensitive movies for adults, Ed Wood, Dark Shadows, Edward Scissorhands, Tim Burton has a second, parallel career as a craftsman of moody, spooky films made for kids and families. While the usual child-geared fare is bright, sunny, full of pop songs, and totally innocuous, Burton manages to express the surreal, frightening, curious elements of childhood without compromising on his depiction of how the world can be a scary place full of bad things and death. Burton works especially well in the medium of stop-motion animation, as he did with the 2005 classic Corpse Bride. It's the folk-tale-like story of the wrongfully murdered Emily, Helena Bonham Carter, drawn to the unsteady Victor, Johnny Depp, a well-to-do young man who's set to be married. To future generations, April 2021 will look like the strangest time capsule. But after a practice wedding proposal goes wrong, Victor finds himself caught up in an undead romance and lost in a strange world full of skeletons. It's a film for kids with adult themes, and that extends to the subtext. Cryptopunks were selling at Sothebys. There's plenty for children to enjoy in Corpse Bride, but there's also lots of material just for adults. Mare of Easttown had the nation saying meust and deun't instead of most or don't. And movie theaters were sort of open, playing the same 4 or 5 movies ad nauseam. Here are some treasures in Corpse Bride made for grown-up sensibilities only. Corpse Bride gives us something to crow about. Corpse Bride is laced with clever, witty, humor of the wordplay variety, and on top of that, death features prominently in the plot, which tends to happen more often than not in the films of Tim Burton, the man responsible for other mortal coil-shedding works like Sweeney Todd, Beetlejuice, and Frankenweenie. But there's one running joke, or flying joke, rather, buried in Corpse Bride that combines puns and death references, and it's so subtle and clever that even most adults wouldn't notice it on the first or second viewing. The plot of Corpse Bride involves the premeditated murder of Emily, the titular Corpse Bride, at the hand of her evil fiancé, Lord Barkey's Bittern, Richard E. one of the month's top grossers. An adaptation of a video game franchise that launched in 1992, and the internet was hype for it. In many ways, Simon McQuaid's big screen take on Mortal Kombat reminded me why we go to the movies. It's not always for art. Sometimes, you want to see a spear shot straight through a bevy of nameless bad guys on the largest screen possible. Sometimes, you want to see a performance that doesn't run circles around the others so much as it burns them off the screen. Grant, who intends to kill again. Mortal Kombat is a glorious celebration of schlock as consumable ephemera, and if its hyper-violent fights, colorful world-building, and clumsy dialogue made your day, here are 12 other films to watch. Mortal Kombat. I'm previously written about Paul W. S. Anderson's first video game film, but let me add the obvious. There is no Mortal Kombat reboot without it. Nor, I suspect, are there the John Wick films or an audience that's ready for the gleefully gonzo cinema of auteur James Wan. Crows can be seen flying around and lingering throughout the movie, and it's not just because these sort of eerie, midnight-colored birds effectively add creepiness and moodiness to the proceedings. Mortal Kombat wasn't supposed to work. A grouping of crows is called a murder, after all, which is a gag that ties nicely into the movie's macabre plot. Upon close inspection, you'll discover the cause of death. There's a lot of death, murder, and attempted murder in Corpse Bride, although there isn't a lot of violence. It was preceded by a misguided disaster and 2 critical failures. To say there were minimal expectations going in is putting it mildly. Hey, this is a PG-rated movie for kids and families, after all, and depicting how the dead people get to be dead is largely inconsequential, as the events of the film are about how they're dealing with life after death, or not, as the case may be for certain zombie corpse brides. Still, the film does suggest how 2 of its deceased characters became permanent residents of the land of the dead and decaying. The area's barber, entrusted with providing a haircut, retrieves his trusty scissors by pulling them out of his own head. This implies that the unlucky former entrepreneur was killed by the very tools of his trade, perhaps by someone extremely unhappy with the haircut he'd provided. As for Emily, the corpse bride herself, viewers know she was killed by the greedy and villainous Lord Barkey's Bittern, but they aren't made privy as to how the act went down. And yet, against all odds, its goofy and sincere butt-kicking exceeded those expectations and endured, paving the way for a more colorful strain of action films steeped in outrageous, glorious lore. Though it's easy to see Mortal Kombat for the knowing B-movie schlock it is today, also remember that, at the time, it was a New Line Cinema tentpole. Yes, he stabs her, but with what? Well, he probably used that sword he's always seen carrying around. Brush up your Shakespeare. The plays of William Shakespeare are more than 400 years old, but they represent the foundation of a lot of Western narrative fiction, be it theater, books, or movies. Plots laid out by the bard recur throughout films, as do individual references to the works themselves. Shakespeare is so important and influential that screenwriters in the 21st century can include a nod and wide swaths of the audience will both get and appreciate the allusions. But that's because most adults receive at least an overview of Shakespeare's greatest hits in a high school or college English literature class. Mortal Kombat, released 4 months after The Basketball Diaries and Friday, and 1 month before Seven, one of these films is not like the other. Little kids watching a movie like Corpse Bride would likely have no clue when filmmakers launch and land a perfect reference to Shakespeare's most famous and epic tragedy Hamlet, which, like Corpse Bride, is full of foreboding actions and the promise of death to the tyrannical villains. Toward the end of the movie, Lord Barkey's Bittern tauntingly toasts Emily for her having died without marrying, and he takes a sip of poison, which had been intended for Victor to drink in order to join Emily in death. And yet, Mortal Kombat has endured despite all the trappings that might have sunk it. That's awfully reminiscent of the accidental poison switcheroo in Act 5 of Hamlet. The titular prince, intending to kill his murderous stepfather, Claudius, is toasted by his mother, Gertrude, with a glass of wine that Claudius had poisoned and intended to give to Hamlet. Corpse Bride is a very punny movie for a movie about dead people. Corpse Bride has a surprisingly light touch, particularly in its dialogue. The script is bright, bouncy, and agile, and along those lines, it's full of groan-inducing puns and old jokes that any goofy dad would proudly steal and make his own. It could have been lost to home video purgatory, or stranded without a home as the industry shifts towards streaming. It wasn't. For example, in The Land of the Dead, Victor meets a short, zombified skeleton dressed in late 18th century military officer regalia, replete with a bicorn hat and a sword. Mortal Kombat is martial arts cinema history. He's instantly recognizable to adults as a riff on French general and European conqueror Napoleon Bonaparte. A bit made overwhelmingly clear when his name is revealed to be General Bonaparte, because he's a skeleton, and skeletons are made of bones. Later, the dead descend on stern Finis Everglot, Albert Finney. In that group is Bonajangles, Danny Elfman, his mission interrupted when his eyeball pops out of its cranial socket and into the brothy bowl that sits in front of Finis. That alone makes it worthy of a rewatch, especially if you loved its reboot. The night comes for us when Mortal Kombat debuted in arcades about 30 years ago. Its violence was quickly criticized by politicians and critics alike. None of them, however, could have imagined a film like The Night Comes for Us, which released on Netflix in 2018 and makes Midway Games' fighting game look like Oliver and Company. And to paraphrase Billy Joel, you should worry about The Night Comes for Us. It has street savior fare. Those streets, of course, are caked in gore and blood. Directed by horror maestro Timo Tjahjanto, The Night Comes for Us marries that genre's specific penchant for viscera to the acrobatic fist-flinging of martial arts films, arriving at a uniquely violent endgame that doesn't take prisoners. He then remarks, "There's an eye in me soup." That's a reference to the nearly ancient joke, and its many variations, of a displeased restaurant patron reporting to the waiter about a fly in their soup. In Mortal Kombat terms, this movie's fatalities have fatalities. The Night Comes for Us gathers some of Thai cinema's finest fighting talents and both shows off their skills and dismembers them. And then there's The Corpse Bride, a woman dealing with the loss of flesh, rapid decay, and death itself. More than any film on this list, it artfully rekindles the transgressive thrill audiences felt when they first encountered Mortal Kombat, no matter what year or decade that was. It is must-see stuff that will scare both the politicians and the critics in your life. The Raid. Like Mortal Kombat, it's easy to imagine 2011's The Raid springing from a video game that became a cultural sensation.
Unlike its awesome but higher-brow sequel, The Raid has a plot that, even by the most generous of descriptions, is in service of its cinematic gameplay. A top-tier squad of police officers is charged with capturing a sociopathic drug lord by infiltrating the slum he runs with an iron fist. She literally isn't in the best physical shape, which is why she's said to have a wonderful personality, an old euphemism used to talk up people who aren't, on the whole, objectively physically attractive. Watch your language. Corpse Bride. It seems like the people who make movies that are ostensibly for kids and clearly marketed to the young ones like to throw in mildly risque jokes. Once inside, the drug lord orders everyone in the building to eliminate the cops by any means necessary. Not only are these little verbal Easter eggs so subtle and specific that children will have no idea anything untoward was said, but they feel like a little reward to adults or parents who dutifully sat through a movie made for children. Corpse Bride has a few examples of innuendo and suggestive dialogue, and some of it is particularly tough for kids to notice because it's somewhat era-appropriate to the film's Victorian sensibility. For example, the Everglots look down their noses at Victor Van Dort and his family because, although they're wealthy, their money comes from running a canned fish empire. They dismissively call the Van Dorts fish merchants, and even though that's what they actually are, it's implied that it's not a respectable profession, particularly because a few hundred years ago, fishmonger was a euphemism for procurer, or a man who manages female sex workers. On another occasion, Victor goes right up to the edge of making a sexually suggestive gesture. While practicing his upcoming wedding vows alone in the forest, he recites, "With this hand, I will cup your," and notices that he's formed a cupping gesture in front of his own chest. He's mildly aghast with this mimed, imaginary groping. There are some really old movie references by the time they get to be the age where they're old enough to have kids with whom they can watch family films like Corpse Bride. Adults have also absorbed volumes of cultural history. Just by living for a few decades and consuming mass quantities of mass media, most grown-ups have unofficially attended film school, and they can recognize references and allusions to older, classic movies placed in the newer works of modern filmmakers who are unabashedly cinema devotees, such as Corpse Bride director Tim Burton. Mayhem ensues. Each one of the set pieces in The Raid feels like a level in which the heroes race towards the big boss, and the cumulative effect of having those battles stacked on top of one another, and populating them with action and martial arts mainstays like Iko Uwais and Joe Taslim, is a film that feels like it almost necessitates save points, or at least moments to catch one's breath. This stop-motion animated film from 2005 is rife with nods to movies as far back as the 1920s and 1930s. References the average child, relatively new to movie consumption, probably wouldn't be able to spot. In a scene in the lair of Elder Gutknecht, Michael Goff, the character's arm passes by a candlelit wall. If the relentless, deadly action is what appeals to you most about 2021's Mortal Kombat, The Raid should be the first film you watch from this list. Mortal Kombat Legends. Scorpion's Revenge. If you didn't know it from the pre-film stinger in Mortal Kombat Legends, Scorpion's Revenge, which sees Scorpion choke slamming a very manic Daffy Duck, Ethan Spaulding's animated film has a wicked sense of humor that allays its frequent bloodshed. Make no mistake, however, the bloodshed is not to be trifled with. It comprises only about a second of screen time, but it's enough to evoke a famous shot from the pioneering 1922 vampire movie Nosferatu. If the extreme eviscerations of Mortal Kombat are the film's primary draw, then Scorpion's Revenge will both honor and test that affection. Put another way, it's almost surprising that Amazon Prime's Invincible jump-started a conversation about violence in animation, when Scorpion's Revenge brutally murdered Satoshi's son a year earlier. Scorpion's Revenge, not all violent theatrics, though. Then in the big musical number, Remains of the Day, the dancing skeletons dance similarly to how the skeletons dance in the spooky 1929 Disney short, The Skeleton Dance. Burton also pays homage to his horror master predecessor, Alfred Hitchcock. Mortal Kombat Legends. Scorpion's Revenge is blessed with a bevy of satisfying vocal performances that elevate its paper-thin characters. Joel McHale is the Johnny Cage that Mortal Kombat fans have deserved for almost 3 decades, while Kevin Michael Richardson adds his usual but always effective gravitas to the four-armed Guro. The group of crows that look down on Vincent recalls the shot of the birds looking down on Tippi Hedren's character in The Birds. The stars came out for Corpse Bride. Corpse Bride often alludes to the stars of some of Hollywood's most classic films. Scorpion's Revenge is as much a violent exercise as it is movie, but it's so deliberately joyful in its approach that it's hard to argue against it. For example, Alfred is an elegant and cultured skeleton, a denizen of the land of the dead who strikes quite the handsome figure in his purple jacket and long, thin mustache. Plus, unlike 2022's Mortal Kombat, it has a tournament. As does its sequel, Mortal Kombat Legends. Battle of the Realms. If we're being honest, Mortal Kombat Legends, Battle of the Realms is almost entirely for completists. Where Mortal Kombat, Scorpion's Revenge, anchors its story in the origin and vengeance of Hanzo, Scorpion, Hasashi, Battle of the Realms tethers itself to an entire cast of ne'er-do-wells and fighters. Liu Kang takes on the Cyber Initiative. Kuei Liang wants vengeance for his brother's passing. And we haven't even gotten to Outworld's invasion of Earth Realm, which is theoretically the main thrust of the movie. If Mortal Kombat: Battle of the Realms sounds overly busy, it is. That said, its careening and whiplash-inducing plot is actually truer to the spirit of the labyrinthine story beats that define the later, Mortal Kombat games. If you already have a passion for said games, their wide range of characters is fervently recreated here. The animated fight choreography is undeniably impressive, somehow bolstering the film's horrifying creativity when it comes to limb-shattering. Go in with low expectations, or think of Battle of the Realms as a bridge between Scorpion's Revenge and future installments, and you won't emerge disappointed. Street Fighter: There isn't a lot to recommend about 1994's Street Fighter. It's mostly a pretty strange mess. That said, it's a pretty strange mess that has Raul Julia playing M. Bison. Raul Julia died shortly after Street Fighter was released. His wife, Gertrude, comments that he's been dead for 15 years, to which he replies, "Frankly, my dear, I don't give a damn." That's a reference to the famous kiss-off line from the 1939 classic Gone with the Wind, uttered to Scarlett O'Hara, Vivien Leigh, by her former love, Rhett Butler, Clark Gable, a character who, like Alfred, favored vibrantly colored suit coats. One major character in Corpse Bride is a full-on imitation of another movie star of Hollywood's golden age, although one who's been relatively forgotten by the 21st century and certainly not someone who kids and toddlers would be familiar with. A maggot, known only as Maggot, lives inside of the rotting but living corpse of Emily. Their relationship is symbiotic in that he presumably lives off her dead flesh but also offers her friendship and guidance. Maggot is voiced by N. Rydell, who delivers a convincing vocal impersonation of actor Peter Lorre, co-star of classics like M, The Maltese Falcon, and Casablanca, and whom Maggot even resembles. Everybody loves Ray Harryhausen. Corpse Bride is an animated movie, but unlike traditional, hand-drawn Disney movies or the computer-enabled, ultra-realistic Pixar style, it was produced via the deliberate and extremely taxing method of stop-motion animation. To greatly simplify, the process involves a staff of animators contracting actual physical models of a film's characters, props, and settings, and then manipulating them just so, taking a picture, and so on, creating the illusion of movement, or animation. Stop-motion animation is how the California Raisins and Wallace and Gromit came to life, and the technique was pioneered by special effects artist Ray Harryhausen, who used the style to bring to life creatures in pre-CGI sci-fi and fantasy films, such as 1963's Jason and the Argonauts and 1966's 1 Million Years BC. He made Street Fighter for his children. In fact, Corpse Bride would never have been possible without the work of Harryhausen, and its filmmakers decided to pay tribute. In the scene where Victor Van Dort sits down to play the piano, he does so on an instrument purportedly made by Harryhausen. Here's to you, Tim Burton. Sure. Tim Burton and his filmmaking cronies who brought Corpse Bride to life reference and pay tribute to a number of old movies, old movie stars, and legendary filmmakers of yore, but they also throw in a few shout-outs to projects that hit closer to home and from the not-so-distant past. Specifically, there are a few allusions, both quiet and unmistakable, to the films of Tim Burton, which adult audiences might be more likely to notice than kids would. At the outset of the film, the Corpse Bride is dead and buried, her not quite final resting place under a large and imposing tree. That tree closely resembles the same tree under which the Headless Horseman is temporarily buried in Burton's 1998 movie Sleepy Hollow. Another Corpse Bride element that looks familiar? The character of Victor Van Dort. Finis Everglot mistakenly, and carelessly, calls Victor by the name Vincent, so perhaps he saw Tim Burton's early short film, Vincent, with a title character who bears a resemblance to Victor. Overall, Corpse Bride concerns dead people taking extreme action against living beings, which is more or less the plot of Burton's 1988 film Beetlejuice. I think about both these facts more often than one might expect, because when they're coupled with Julia's performance in Street Fighter, they are a symphony that rips at the heartstrings. Bison is, both literally and metaphorically, acting to save his life. Nor is Corpse Bride the first Burton project to feature a zombie dog. His 1984 short film, Frankenweenie, and the 2012 full-length animated remake of the same name are both about a dead dog come back to life, much like how Victor is reunited with his beloved, lost pet Scraps in Corpse Bride. Lord Barkin Bittern didn't do his due diligence. An adult mindset brings a different perspective to a film than that of a child. Not only does life experience and a deeper cultural knowledge offer another point of view, as well as the ability to notice movie references or Easter eggs, but the intelligence learned just by spending more time on the planet allows adults to notice plot holes or character inconsistencies that would likely not bother a child audience member one bit. Julius' work has all the knowing, go-for-broke energy of a performer who's aware that his time on the stage of life is ending. Raoul Julia, Juilliard graduate, studied real-life megalomaniac world leaders to play a guy who would chew scenery even if he had no teeth left. In Corpsebride, such a problem exists in the motivations of the film's primary villain, the loathsome Lord Barkis Bittern. We're told that the ends don't justify the means, but Julius' means are so infused with undeniable life that they make one want to clap back, don't they? This is a career-defining performance in a movie with little definition. This is, for the last time, Raoul Julia, movie star. Bloodsport. There are many downsides to aging, but one of the more pervasive is discovering that the pop culture ephemera you grew up with is leaving society's collective consciousness. He's the former fiancé of the deceased Emily, having killed her and robbed her of her wealth. Disney Adventures magazine. That becomes his modus operandi, to convince women to marry him, stealing their treasures, then killing them. Making things complicated, Victoria's, Emily Watson. Parents prefer the dashing, old, presumably moneyed Bittern to Victor, and they decide to marry off their daughter to him instead of Victor, when Victor absconds with the undead Emily against his will. The AOL dial-up tone. This is mostly according to Bittern's plan. He wants the Everglots to allow him to marry Victoria so that he can cash in on the dowry and then murder Victoria thereafter. However, the Everglots are actually broke, and they thought they were the ones going into the marriage for financial gain. But if Bittern's grand plan is to marry for money, wouldn't he have properly researched beforehand if the Everglots were, in fact, wealthy? There are some familiar Burton players in the mix. Tim Burton is one of those filmmakers who likes to work with the same actors over and over again. A spirit of collaboration and a shared storytelling language emerges when directors and performers make several movies together, leading to a definitive movie-making style. And, in no way least of all, Jean-Claude Van Damme's all-time action effort, Bloodsport. Released in 1988, Bloodsport is the film that made JCVD a star. Corpsebride, both dark and sweet, certainly feels like a film made by the man who also directed Edward Scissorhands and produced The Nightmare Before Christmas, and that could be due to his enlisting several of his most frequent compatriots, actors who older viewers could very well recognize on voice alone. Johnny Depp leads the cast as Victor Van Dort, having been directed by Burton previously in Edward Scissorhands, Ed Wood, Sleepy Hollow, and Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. Helena Bonham Carter portrays Emily, and she'd worked with Burton in Big Fish and Planet of the Apes. The late Michael Gough, Elder Gutknecht, played butler Alfred Pennyworth in Burton's Batman films, while his composer of choice, Danny Elfman, portrays Skeleton Bonajangles, the spiritual cousin of Jack Skellington, who Elfman voiced in The Nightmare Before Christmas. Deep Roy co-starred in two 2005 Burton films, in Corpsebride as General Bonaparte and the Oompa Loompas in Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, and Albert Finney followed his role in Burton's 2004 drama Big Fish by voicing Phineas Everglot.
Though he would go on to star in larger and higher-grossing movies, few were a more impeccable showcase for his physical talents. The eye-popping footwork, the cinematic physique, they were the movie's aces in the hole, and ones that Bloodsport used with the abandon of a player down on chips. That the film sports a young Forrest Whitaker and not Grammy-nominated anthems performed by Paul Delph is just icing on the cake. Most importantly, Bloodsport is the movie that makes both the Mortal Kombat movie and the games possible. Bloodsport was even used to pitch the original game. It has the flimsiest of stories. Its main attraction is a tournament, and its box office exceeded its budget by more than 20 times over. If Bloodsport didn't pave the way for the fighting game boom, it was released 4 years before the first Mortal Kombat came out, then it almost certainly lit the path. That makes it history worth knowing. Five Deadly Venoms. The Shaw Brothers' body of work is the root of most modern martial arts films. Shang-Chi borrows from the duo's ecstatic and thrilling wire work. John Wick, their absurdism and ability to shift between brutality and comedy. So, while it's as easy as breathing to say that the Shaw Brothers influenced 2021's Mortal Kombat, and you should watch one of their films if you enjoyed it, you still need to know which one. Predictably, the answer is as obvious as the question. 1978's Five Deadly Venoms has a bad guy named Scorpion. It also has a bad guy named Lizard, which is synonymous with reptile. Its characters wear incredible and intricate masks and headgear, and perform what might be described as special moves. Five Deadly Venoms was Mortal Kombat before Mortal Kombat existed. It's essential viewing if you love the property in any way, shape, or form. Kung Fu Hustle. In some ways, Stephen Chow is the natural successor to the Shaw brothers. Both are from Hong Kong. Both are partial to martial arts heavy genre bending exercises that favor magical realism over boring stuff like gravity and logic. The primary difference between them is one of tone. The Shaw brothers' films maintain an inherent sense of dignity, even as some wackiness encroaches. Stephen Chow's films, though, are never worried about composure. As the Looney Tunes have proved for over 90 years, dignity is overrated. Kung Fu Hustle, in particular, understands and expounds on this. There's no shortage of Wile E. Coyote and Roadrunner-like one-upmanship to its frequently madcap fights. Some are accented with pew-pew sound effects. Others feature random, sunset-accentuated pratfalls. Kung Fu Hustle, like 2021's Mortal Kombat, understands that, if its characters primarily exist to smash each other senselessly, they should be able to make us laugh as they're doing so, if necessary. Battle royale fights in films are rarely fun simply because people are fighting. For a fight to sing, there must be more than violence, there must be conflict. Even if the stakes are slight, their existence is a four-course meal for the right combatants and choreographers. So, it figures that Battle Royale is not only a classic manga, but one of the greatest action films of the past 20 years. It has all-time great stakes. A high school class embarks on a field trip when, without warning, the students are gassed and taken to a remote island. They awake wearing explosive collars. As part of an annual battle royale, they now have 3 days to fight to the death until one student emerges victorious. And if the students don't engage with their killer instincts, those collars will kill them. The best part? Most of this is conveyed in the opening scrawl. Has a premise ever taken its characters from zero to murderous more swiftly? Even better, unlike 2021's Mortal Kombat, Battle Royale finds time to take a break from the bloodshed to reflect on social anxieties, especially the ways that adults pass down their histories with violence onto their children. Battle Royale may hinge on its intro, but its thematic layers and terrific execution are what make it a must-watch. John Wick. Chapter 3 Parabellum. There's little argument that Chad Stahelski, David Leitch, and Derek Kolstad's John Wick films represent the pinnacle of modern American action cinema. Each subsequent installment aims to outdo the last by dizzying degrees, whether it's through putting motorcycle riding bad guys against Keanu Reeves on a horse or making a new subset of New York's population an asset to assassins. Fans of Mortal Kombat should enjoy any installment of the Wick trilogy. They're that consistent and thrilling. For my money, though, it's John Wick. Chapter 3 inches that is the finest offering for those who enjoyed Simon McQuaid's film. It has the series' most wicked brawls. It treats more than one character to an unfathomably violent outcome. And, like both the Mortal Kombat films and games, it is deeply steeped in ridiculous lore. The mythos of the John Wick films has emerged as one of its most endearing elements, and the lengths to which Parabellum spins it almost ensure that John Wick will fight the champions of the Nether Realm in John Wick 5 inches, and, probably, win. The Paper Tigers. There are, happily, a number of strong contenders for 2021's Best Action Film. Bob Odenkirk's Tremendous, John Wick adjacent, Nobody, Guy Ritchie's shockingly grim, Wrath of Man, and, most unlikely, Quoc Bao Tran's The Paper Tigers. In some ways, The Paper Tigers is the least Mortal Kombat-like movie on this list. It's deeply grounded in the real world, one in which martial artists far from their prime reunite during middle age and pull muscles mid-fight. There's a weight and cost to the violence that, while funny, never prioritizes the bone breaks over the way loss breaks hearts. When The Paper Tigers marries that weight to its gorgeously choreographed fights, this scrappy film becomes an underdog that not only comes through in the clutch, but lays waste to the competition. In that sense, The Paper Tigers is what The Karate Kid promised by way of Cobra Kai. And, in playing to our childhood and adult sensibilities simultaneously, it becomes essential viewing for anyone who grew up, or is growing up, with Mortal Kombat.